in Portuguese or even not in Spanish. This is one of the problems we have when we well, work on different parts of the world, and then the only language that we speak is English, no? Which is of course an advantage, but also a huge problem, because English also has its deficits and its difficulties, particularly if we speak about certain theories.
Yes.
Okay, so this evening I'm talking about Henri Lefebvre, and I mean, well, Latin America is a place where, I mean, academics and students, they, well, quite some of them in social sciences and in architecture, they know Henri Lefebvre, and his books were also translated very early on in Spanish and in Portuguese. So in other countries that was much later the case. So very briefly for an introduction, so Henri Lefebvre was a French philosopher and sociologist, and so he was a contemporary of other famous French philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, and many others. So what made Lefebvre special, actually, is that he was not just a philosopher, but he was also somebody who really tried to apply his theories. So he presented himself also as a sociologist. So not just the philosophy was important for him, but also sociology. And even more so, he at a certain moment said, I don't want to be a philosopher anymore. I also want to be a practitioner. And he worked together with architects, he worked together with activists. He played also a role in the cultural life and in the cultural and political life in France. So in the 1920s and 30s, he worked together with the Surrealists. In the 1950s, he worked together with the Situationists. So you see, he had also contacts to, let's say, activists, but also artists and writers. So he had a very interesting kind of life beyond just the pure kind of philosophical reflections. Now, for us in urban studies, Lefebvre is, to this day, is a key figure because he made a range of interventions and wrote a range of books that still today are very, very important milestones in the history of urban research and urban studies. So, I mean, Lefebvre wrote something like about 70 books in his life. So I only show some of them, highlight some of them. So to start with his, already, I mean, in the 1920s, he founded together with some of his, as a student actually, together with some of his friends and colleagues, a group. They called themselves Les Philosophes, the Philosophs, and they founded a journal. It was Philosophie. And in the 1930s, then, together with the Surrealists, this group also discovered Marxism. Marxism in the early 20th century was not a big deal in France. So in the 20s and 30s, Marxism became much more important and prominent. And already in 1939, Lefebvre wrote an important book, Le Matérialisme Dialectique, so dialectical materialism. And we have already two terms here that are key for Lefebvre. So materialism, so he was decidedly a materialist, and dialectics played an important role in his philosophy and in his activities. After the Second World War, he made something that was very unusual at the time for philosophers. He started to analyze everyday life. And so his first book was, he published already in 1947, and during his entire life, he published about everyday life as a kind of a key aspect of a philosophy that is not a philosophy for the, let's say, the important things, but that is also an instrument and a tool for all those things that we encounter in everyday life. For him to change society as a Marxist, which was a key element of his work, he said we have to understand everyday life. If we are revolutionaries, and we have to be clear that the revolution starts in everyday life or it will never happen. So it's not just kind of the big moments that were important for him, but also the very, let's say, not important, the kind of these kind of everyday activities that had a big importance for his work. Now, in this, in approaching everyday life and analyzing everyday life in France, he made a discovery already in the late 1950s, and this discovery was a process that became more and more important for him, and this process was urbanization. And it is an interesting encounter when for the first time he somehow met this kind of process. So he was born in the Pyrenees, and he regularly returned to his family house in the Pyrenees. But of course he lived in Paris and taught in Paris and had his activities in Paris. But it was in the Pyrenees where he encountered urbanization very close to his village where he grew up, in a new town. A new town was built, an industrial town built by the state, and there he somehow saw the shock of the modernity that comes in the 50s into this very, very rural landscape, where suddenly urbanization starts to make its mark. Now, he started slowly with researching about the urban question, and in 1968, which was an important moment in France and particularly in Paris, it was the famous May '68 in Paris. So, a kind of an urban revolt, erupted in the streets of Paris, and the students and the workers together started to really make a kind of an upheaval in the streets of Paris. And in that very year, he published his first book about the city, Le Droit à la Ville, and the right to the city. And then, in already 2 years later, I will just come back to that, he published a second book, La Révolution Urbaine, and then he published a third book about the production of space. Later on, a book that is completely under the radar, that really very little people really work about it, is about the state. He developed an important theory of the state, who was never translated in any other language, and he was even, it is even only the first print run that it was never a second edition. So this book is very rare and is not is very difficult available for people. So they don't know that. So most of even the Lefebvre specialists don't know that book very well. Now, what he did with his with this short moment, I mean, you see it's a very short moment where Lefebvre really wrote his important works for us in urban studies, in urban geography, in urban sociology, in architecture, in urbanism. And it was basically in a short time of 6 years that he made a huge trajectory to a completely different understanding of the urban question. It started with this book, Le Droit à la Ville, which was a book, The Right to the City, which was a book that was clearly inspired by this revolt that went on in Paris. And I'm still not so sure where this term comes from. I'm pretty sure, but I have no proofs, that this was something that somebody sprayed somewhere in the streets of Paris. The right to the city, we want to have the right to the city, we want the city. This was a call that time and again erupted in many, many different places. And it became his most famous title, The Right to the City. Only 2 years later, Lefebvre wrote a different book, The Urban Revolution, La Révolution Urbaine. And that book starts with a famous phrase, the first phrase of the book. I would like to start with a hypothesis, the hypothesis of the complete urbanization of society. And he called that a strategic hypothesis. Now, it is 2 years after Le Droit à la Ville. So 2 years after he wrote the book about the city and the right to the city, he writes, the city is vanishing. It is a kind of a relic of the past. It is a thing of the past, an object of the past. The city as such doesn't exist anymore because it is somehow superseded by a process, and the process is urbanization. And it's an interesting contradiction in his own work. But it was a massive shift from an object that he looked at, the city, and the city with borders and something that you think you can identify clearly, to something that is not, that you can't identify anymore, that is a process, and the process goes on and goes on and goes on until it transforms the entire society. And he meant the entire society worldwide. He even used already at that time the term the planetary urbanization. Urbanization becomes a planetary process, a process that becomes visible in the most remote and improbable areas. Now, that became, of course, so that was a very important epistemological shift from an object to a process, and from the discussion of city and countryside and their relationships to a completely different perspective, this contradiction between city and countryside are vanishing, and we find the new contradictions, the new social contradictions in the process itself, in the process of urbanization itself. And then again, 4 years later, in 1974, he published a book with the, at the time, very enigmatic title, La production de l'espace, the production of space. It came as something that at the time people didn't understand at all what that means. So it was something, this book went almost unnoticed. Some specialists read it in French. It wasn't translated in many languages. It needed about 20 years until the early, 1990s, until this book and its title, The Production of Space, became important. Interestingly enough, not in France, but in the US. So it was a time of the postmodern geography that made that book famous. Edward Zoja is one of them, and some others. And there, in a very different context, this kind of concept became important. But if you have a closer look at it, we can say that it is a more general kind of idea about urbanization as a process, but how can we understand that process if at a certain moment the entire planet gets urbanized? How can we analyze this process? How can we analyze the situation? And Lefebvre's answer was, we can analyze that if we analyze the production, the space, not as a given, not as a natural space, but something that is produced by society itself. So a very kind of strange idea for the time, and still I think today for many a difficult thing to understand. Now, okay, what is my relationship to Lefebvre? So I started actually my academic career as an activist, not in the street of Paris, but in the streets of Zurich in 1980, where we had, I can't go into the details here, but we had really a very fierce urban revolt in Zurich, which is not a very big town. Well, it is quite an international city, but it's not so big. And it was a huge surprise that in this city, suddenly young people started to start a revolt and to fight for a different city. So that was the point where we as a group started, we were 4 geographers, we started to look at this process. We were part of this revolt, and at a certain moment we thought, okay, can we understand that? We tried to understand that, and we said it must have to do something with the urban, with the city, with urbanization of Zurich, and then started to read about it, because in Zurich nobody ever did kind of research on urban. The urban research was almost inexistent, so we had to do it by ourselves. And that was also in the spirit of that revolt. Do it yourself, create your own kind of ideas, create your own capacities, and we did the same with theory and with urban research. Okay, 10 years later, we started to, we did a lot of things. We also started to do scientific research. We also wrote a book about the urban question, about urban theory. And then about 10 years later, I wanted to have a closer look at this very, still at the time, so around 1990, it was still of this theory of Henri Lefebvre that I found very promising and very fruitful for further research. And I started to write a dissertation, and after about 10 years, of course I did a lot of other things in that time also, but finally I published that book, Stadt, Raum und Gesellschaft, and then on the theory of the production of space. Now, the problem producing a book in German, who the hell reads German? It's just hopeless. Nobody. And German, urban studies is not a very important kind of part of urban studies. And German geography was very conservative for a very long time. Okay, so, but it took me almost another 20 years finally to do a kind of translation of that book, which only appeared now some years ago in 2022, which, of course, is its own problem. I think here you, in Brazil and in Latin America, you know that problem very well. Because, I mean, there's such a rich literature, particularly on the question of urbanization and the question of center and periphery. And most of that was for a long time not available in English and not available in French, well, a little bit sometimes. And so it just went unnoticed for the rest of the world. Of course, I mean, Spanish and Portuguese, I mean, is I think, about the third important language together, I would say, in the world. I mean, after Chinese and English. But still, large parts of the world don't speak Spanish and don't understand Portuguese. So, well, so you know what it means. And only very recently, this important literature, finally now, only in the last, I would say, last 5 years, there are now more of those texts available in English. Now, so what was my kind of work with Lefebvre? I mean, I was somehow socialized in a very German tradition. So there you make a kind of analysis of texts that is quite, I would say, careful. Quite, so what I made was a kind of a reconstruction of Lefebvre's theory. And I really made a big, I mean, a big, I could say, I mean, effort to understand really the key elements of the theory in its entirety. It was, at the end, a very ambitious project. And I started, of course, with the epistemological basis of that, and that is dialectics, which is unusual, because everybody knows, yes, dialectics is Marx, yes, Hegel, yeah, he developed that. And, so basically a German thing, you know? Something I understand as German-speaking scholar. And what it turned out that Lefebvre is also a strong, I mean, works strong with dialectics, and he works with the German dialectics. So he works with Hegel, he works with Marx and their dialectics, and even with Nietzsche, and even interprets Nietzsche in his dialectical triad. And so this is one of the key, and he understood German. He even translated certain important works from German into French. So here we have, this is one of these important moments, a kind of a French-German dialogue, which today is gone. But it was at the beginning of the 20th century, it was quite an important thing. So many people could understand and write and speak German and French, from France and from Germany. So, so here we have an element that is unusual for most of the readers otherwise. This German dialectics that he put into the core of his theory. And then there's a second aspect I could reconstruct, which is phenomenology, which is actually already a kind of German-French co-production. And I just mentioned here some names. Maurice Merleau-Ponty is French, Gaston Bachelard, Martin Heidegger, obviously German, and there are some others that I could now mention, Schütz and others. They are German and French, and so here, it's a kind of a tradition, phenomenological tradition, that was available actually for both parts of this French-German, well, sometimes a real a kind of a war, no? With two world wars that played out between these two countries. But still, I mean, on philosophy and on let's say intellectual capacities, still an important kind of conversation. Now, but then the results of that, and that I can't then explain now, that would be a lecture in its own. What Lefebvre did was he developed a kind of three-dimensional dialectics. So usually dialectic is something between, is a kind of is based on contradictions. Usually have two contradictions. Let's say the rural-urban contradiction. This is something of between two poles, and then it evolves. Now I don't go into details because that would become a philosophy lecture now. But what is interesting with Lefebvre is that he somehow set a third pole. It's not just two poles, but a three-dimensional type of dialectics. And this is the dialectics of the production of space. And I just explain it now with the three poles, just that you have an idea. On the one hand, he looks at space. So the first thing is space as such doesn't exist. It is a product. It is a social product. It is produced by societies. And the first, let's say, pole of that is what he calls the perceived space, or the spatial practice. So it's a space that you can perceive with the five senses. So we can see it, we can smell it, we can touch it, we can hear it. So it's something physical. So if we move in space, then we are producers of space. If we walk on a path, or if we walk through the grass and then we make a path through the grass, this is already an element of the production of space, and then we can think about that up to constructing motorways and factories and cities and. Now there is a second element, and Lefebvre said you can't see a space without having it conceived before. So here comes conceived space, conceived, espace conçu. Now we think that is a bit funny. I mean, we can see the things. Yes, of course we can see the things. We can see a street, for instance. But, I mean, what belongs to the street? Are the facades of the houses, are they part of the street? What is the street as such? So immediately it needs a definition. So whatever spatial categories we have to define them, and that is a mental activity. And and this is a social activity. It's not you or I. We don't define that. Society defines that. We give them names. So it is a process that is an intellectual process, and it is also a process that is related to power. You could say that who can define what is a space has also power over that space. Now, okay, on the one hand, so we have a definition, we have kind of mental space, we have, let's say, physical space, and then there is a third space, and Lefebvre, for him, this was a key element, lived space, espace vécu. So he didn't invent that term. It comes from the French debate of the time, the 2030s, but it is an important element, and that means I think the simplest way to explain that is, so you can see something. Yes, it's a nice, it's a nice space, or it's an ugly space. Well, we can have a concept of it. We can give it names, but there is something more, and that's affectation. So it has to do with our bodies. It has to do with our also with our experiences. And the simplest way to put that is, the place of the first kiss will always be a very special space for the two lovers. No? And so whenever you come to that place, and wherever it is, could be an idyllic corner somewhere at the lake, or it could be, I don't know, in a supermarket, or it could be, I don't know, in a parking structure, or in a dark corner somewhere. It will always be full of emotions. So that's a specificity of space, that it has emotional values. I just stop here because that would become too complicated now, but I think it's important to have these three dimensions, that space has three different dimensions in Lefebvre's definition. Yeah, so I jumped that. Yeah, I also jumped that. And now, so to what I did in my book actually was to finally try to understand, let's say, the framework that Lefebvre developed. And this is a very interesting framework. It's a very rich framework. And I came to the conclusion at the end of my book, what he did was not just a theory of the production of space. What he in fact did was developing a general social theory that is specifically oriented towards space and time. So he integrated space and time constitutively into his theory. And that's, again, quite unusual, because most of the general social theories are theories of time, related to time, to social change, to social progress, to revolutions, to whatever. And most of them don't really have a relationship to space. And he turned that around. Again, I don't explain now the entire grades, but maybe later on we find moments when we discuss. We can discuss that. Now, the trouble with Henri. So at a certain moment there was a real Lefebvre revivals, particularly in the 1990s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s. So in the last 20, 30 years, Lefebvre became really a well-known figure in many different studies, in social sciences, in humanities, in architecture, urban design. And everybody somehow had the same problem. I mean, how can we apply this very complex theory? Well, I mean, what we did was, some years ago we published a book, here more towards the question of the urban revolution, Henri Lefebvre in social research and architecture. So I teamed up with Lukas Stanek and August Morawansky, two theologians of architecture and urban design, and there we put together a series of chapters that showed the different ways we can engage and really apply Lefebvre's theory. Now, there are a lot of possibilities. I mean, you can analyze it with kind of cultural anthropology, with ethnographic methods. You can, there are a lot of ways that you analyze all sorts of developments, all sorts of situations, where Lefebvre can be very useful kind of tool, can be very useful instrument for analyzing situations that otherwise are difficult to grasp. Now, So our first, let's say, really, let's say, well, big project to apply Lefebvre's theory to a concrete question was a project that was very unusual at the time. It is here, it's the German version. It exists in German, in French, and in English, and you can download it. It's open access now, and it was a project that was that somehow fall from the skies, that suddenly emerged. A project that was, so the leaders were actually 4 architects and 1 geographer. So geographer was obviously me, but the 4 architects was Jacques Herzog, Pierre Demeron, Marcel Mali, and Roger Diener, and particularly the first 2, Jacques Herzog and Pierre Demeron, are quite famous names, I would say, still today. And they didn't want to do architecture, but they founded a kind of what they call the Studio Basel. Basel is a neighboring city of Zurich, and the point that so they didn't want to have the studio in Zurich at the ETH, where the Faculty of Architecture is. So it was a kind of, you could say, a dépendance, a place for experiments. And their first experiment that they wanted to do was to understand what is urban Switzerland. Now, this is a question that might look a bit silly. I mean, urban Switzerland, I mean, what could that be? No, everybody knows Switzerland is full of cows, it produces cheese and chocolate and watches and stuff, but urban Switzerland, I mean, what could that be? And so that was exactly the point that this team wanted to analyze, and they asked me to join them, and I came, I was just finalizing my work on Lefebvre, and I said, okay, yes, we can do that, and Lefebvre can help us in this analysis. And we developed a set of 3 terms. So how can, and the important thing is that we had students of architecture who worked in that, so the Studio Basel was actually composed of these 5 professors, and then the students. And the students made kind of studios, architectural studios, and they didn't design something, but they did research. And they did research on what is urban Switzerland. And I mean, the starting point of that was that we had a huge map on the wall of Switzerland, and we had some dart, and we had 1 dart, and then each student had to throw the dart on the map, and then wherever the dart landed, to go there, and then to go there and make some analysis, take photographs, talk with people, make maps, come back and share with us his or her experiences. So it was quite, so it shows a little bit that kind of groove that we had here. And then we collected during 5 years. We collected more and more and more data until we had an almost complete understanding of the entirety of Switzerland and even the neighboring areas. And so we worked with 3 key terms: networks, borders, and differences, to analyze something that students could work with. So I changed somehow the theory, because there was no time to explain to students the whole theory of Lefebvre. So I had to find something, so how we could apply that. And we said, okay, analyze networks, then we have the physical space, we have perceived space. Analyze the borders, then we understand the territories. So we have the conceived space. And analyze the differences, and then you understand what lived space could be in these areas. And the result was a map. And it was really the first time, I mean, in the meantime I did a lot of research, the first time that an entire territory was somehow analyzed under the aspect, under the hypothesis of the complete urbanization of society. So we said, so Switzerland, yes, has a lot of cows, but in our analysis, don't be mistaken. These are not rural cows; these are urban cows. So, and so in that sense, we also looked at areas that are commonly understood as rural, also the mountain valleys, and there are some large agricultural territories. But then we looked how urbanization transformed these areas. So for the first time, actually, this kind of an entire territory, these very different components, was analyzed under that aspect. And at the end, we made a kind of a typology. And that was a first way to understand this territory. We made 5 types. We had metropolitan regions, we had networks of cities, we had quiet zones, we had then alpine resorts, okay, the famous tourist resorts of Switzerland, and we had also what we call alpine fallowlands, so areas in the mountains that are kind of more peripheral. And we constructed that in a way that with overlapping shades. So we developed an entire method, cartographic method, how we can identify different, what we call urban configurations. And that is suddenly a new way to look at urban spaces. So this is Zurich. And this is the metropolitan region of the Lac Léman, and that's Geneva and Lausanne. So now, out of that, we thought we could further develop that approach, and we called it a territorial approach. Now, there are other territorial approaches that some of them, they call themselves territorial approaches, others not. I think, particularly in Latin America, there's a lot of debates about territory. And I mean, of course, Roberto Montemor is one of them with his concept of extended urbanization. Aníbal Quijano is kind of his approach of center and periphery that has many parallels to Lefebvre's analysis of urbanization. Fernando Coronil himself explains that Lefebvre, for him, is the only Western Marxist that he can use for the analysis of former colonial spaces. Because in colonial spaces, the land is a key factor. And most of Marxists, Western Marxists, they didn't look on the land. But Lefebvre did. And that was something that Coronil thought. That is something that is very important. And of course, land, space, territory. And then also Milton Santos, and he, of course, writes about space and territory. Sometimes a bit difficult to understand how he distinguishes the two, but that's another story. Then you find other approaches in France. Well, in French, not in France. So Claude Raffestin maybe tells you something. He made a kind of a very interesting combination of Lefebvre and Foucault, and developed a specific concept of the territory and of power. And Claude Raffestin comes from Geneva, so he's Swiss. And then there's, but with that concept, there are also groups in Italy that work with that, particularly the Florence School. Maybe you know Alberto Maniaghi, who wrote about that. And they called their approach explicitly the territorial approach. And then in the last maybe 10, 15, 20 years, we have also a kind of territorial approach that was developed in China to understand urbanization processes in China. And interestingly enough, they are also strongly inspired by Henri Lefebvre. So Ling Tang from Hong Kong and Kiping Wong, which was a former PhD student of me, both used heavily Lefebvre's theory to analyze Chinese urbanization. And then we developed our own, at Studio Basel, our own approach, where we looked on different patterns and pathways of urbanization. I will just come back to that in a moment. And where we also did a book on, or a whole series of researches on large, very large territories. And you see on the top, there is also a study on Belo Horizonte. So if you ask me, where can you get that? We did quite an effort in the last year. So you can download all the books of ETH Studio Basel on that webpage. And also these fat books. So we're here to understand, so how can we analyze now a territory where we don't have cities anymore, where we don't have a countryside anymore, where we don't really understand what's going on there. The whole development is in constant move, constantly kind of changing situations. And the interesting thing is that Lefebvre gives us already a starting point for that kind of analysis. And that's what he called the horizontal and vertical complexity. And he used that approach, or he developed it, not to analyze urbanization, but to analyze a very rural valley, the Vallée de Gambin, in the midst of the Pyrenees. And he said, analyzing this territory, and he did that in the, he was during the Second World War, had to somehow escape, so he somehow escaped to the Pyrenees, so that the Nazis didn't find him, and there he made also research, or started his research, and then made full-blown research about that, and he said, to understand this valley, this really rural valley, and he said, so he realized that there are, there's the presence of so there is a horizontal complexity created by the presence of social formations and structures of the same historical time. And then he found out that, of course, there are also the simultaneous presence and coexistence of social formations originating from different times, and so it needs a vertical analysis. Now, we use that kind of idea to a concept we call somehow similar, I mean, we call patterns and pathways of urbanization. And we use that idea of horizontal or synchronic analysis, grasping the present situation of a concrete urban territory, and a vertical or diachronic analysis, understanding the historical production process of this same territory. And now this kind of, how can we distinguish patterns, different patterns on the territory? We call that urban configurations. I showed you, we did that already for Switzerland. Now, I'll just give you a short idea how you can do that in a very different context, which was Havana. It was a very interesting project, the Seminario Internacional de Desarrollo Urbano y Transporte. And it was a project that was already 20 years ago, from 2005 to 2008. And it was a situation in which, and that's also showing how we can do research with almost no resources. So the idea behind that was so the Cubans wanted to have an understanding of their city, and they saw that we were working on our Swiss portrait, on this urban portrait, and they said, well, could we do that also in Havana? And they invited me to come to Havana and to do several workshops with them. Now the situation was very different than in the case of Switzerland, because we had almost no data. We had even no maps. So I came with one of the very first Google maps that we produced, that my assistant produced in hours and hours and hours to put that together, and then we came with the first kind of aerial view that was available. And the situation was a bit desperate. And then I said, look, the point is that, of course, we don't have much data, but you are the experts. And in that team were, let's say, some of the best experts of Havana in planning, architecture, and geography. And so I said, look, you have really good understanding of your city. Havana didn't change much in those years. So you really know how, you know your city. Now you know it so well. So what we can do is we sit together and we start to sketch it. Basically, I don't sketch, of course, because I don't know Havana, but the team, of course, they started to sketch. And after 5 meetings, 5 workshops, we came up with a result, with an analysis of the entirety of the city of Havana. And there are now different colors. No? We defined different urban configurations. And now, just to show you, what you can do with this, very briefly, and to have, it's already late, to have some kind of, also some inspiration from a city that, there was almost no real research done. There's a lot of stuff done on Havana, but not really about urban development of Havana. There's one book that exists by Mario Coyula and two other famous architects at the time about the history of the planning of Havana, but not about the present situation. So we came up with a kind of, we started to understand that Havana has a dual structure. And you see that already here. You see on the top, you see something is blue, and that's blue is obviously along the coast. And then you have something in red in the middle, or orange in the middle, which is a huge thing. And we started actually with understanding that Havana exists of 2 different configurations that are very different, but they are even not homogeneous, but very heterogeneous even to make it even more complicated. So let's start with the blue, what we then call the blue strip. We call it the blue strip. Now, if you go to Havana, I don't know who was in Havana. Okay. So I guess, but we will see that. We can discuss maybe after that. So people that go to Havana, they go to the blue strip, and only to the blue strip. This is really the place where, and then we started also to make some detailed analysis. So this is the place where all the iconographic kind of landscapes are. This is the place where all the restaurants and the hotels are. This is the place where the government buildings are. This is the place where all the important infrastructure, social infrastructure, are, and so on. So it is a kind of it's like a very stretched out centrality. And you can be sure that most of the architects and most of the researchers and most of the journalists and so on, they all go to the blue strip. Now, so the blue strip as such is quite heterogeneous, and to have some images of that. And yeah, here's nightlife, of course. Nightlife is also concentrated in the Blue Street. Very, very, very briefly. So here you have, of course, Havana Vieja, so the historic core, which is now, you could say, it's renovated. This is a project in itself, but which is, of course, the place that everybody goes. You know, it's kind of old Havana, this old center of Havana, of course, iconic in any respect. Then you have the famous boulevard along the coast, along the sea, the Malecon, where, of course, everybody goes there, as you see, and hanging out during the day and during the evening. And okay, so and then you see this is the more tourist-oriented part, Vedado, with the hotels. I mean, the historical hotels. Of course, all of them built before the revolution. The revolution was 1959. And then if you go further towards, this is still in the center. So this is the central area, still Vedado. This kind of, I mean, it's quite pleasant. It's a quite pleasant place to be. It's quite a good quality. I mean, there's a massive deterioration of the buildings. That's another story. But as such, it's a quite pleasant place. If you go further west, you come now to the old rich areas. So Miramar with the huge villas and the embassies. Today these are the embassies. And then it ends somewhere still, of course, with some nice place at the shore of the sea. So that's the Blue Strip. And then we contrasted that Blue Strip to somehow its opposite. And we called it Havana Profunda, so deep Havana. And it came out of a joke, because when we did that research, I said, okay, I would like to see other parts of Havana. And then, so could we go to Diez del Cubre, which is a neighborhood? I would like to go there and to understand more about it. And then one of the people there, he made a joke. Oh, you want to go to Deep Havana? I said, exactly, I want to go to Deep Havana. So we went there, and I mean, the roads were already at the time not very good. Today they're just horrible. We suddenly found out that this is a very heterogeneous area, started to analyze it, started to see that there are different centralities here, different centers that play important roles in everyday life, but nobody knows them. Nobody knows them. So it is really completely off the map. But in fact, it's the core of Havana, and it's the geographical center of Havana. I mean, the Blue Strip is eccentric, no? It's at the periphery, actually, no, of the built-up area. But it's the center, and so you have a very strange kind of structure through this situation. But most of so here, about 1 million of the about 2.2 million people lived here, no? So and so it even didn't have a name. Nobody looked at it. And once then we made an excursion. We went there also with students. We made an excursion. We went with the bus there, and then some guy came and running and said, "Look! All these tourists that are coming to our neighborhood." So and this is a situation that is very heterogeneous. So you see here the historic structure. These are the way how it was constructed. This is the grid, the street grid. So you can already imagine that this must be quite an interesting, urbanistically, quite an interesting area. And indeed, I mean, you have, so this is still Havana. This is still the Havana with the columns, famous columns of Havana. But of course, collapsing, no, in a horrible shape. You see such situations in summer, kids playing football in the midst of the street. you see these are very, you see also it's very different neighborhoods. There are quite some originally quite rich neighborhoods. There are some great villas from the 1920s, and there are all sorts of different places also here. Here you see one of the still. I mean, this was quite an important building, of course, now in decay. And here you see, we look now from the back towards the center. Actually, we are in the geographical center and look to the periphery, but it's the inverse situation. We are here in a social periphery and are looking towards the center at the coast. So so here we could really make a contribution, and we started to develop that concept. We started also to use it for planning. So we used that for planning. So it's discussed in the planning, because the planners were on board with that project, and they so we can really use it to show also where are the kind of the difficulties, where should be the priorities for planning process, and so you can really use that instrument somehow from scratch to do a kind of an important contribution to the planning of Havana, but also to the understanding of Havana. Now, if you ask me where can you download that, you can't download it yet because the book is still not written yet. We have everything together. We have the analysis and everything. And so next year we will finally make the last push to write it, publish it. We have a publisher. We have the money reserved. It will be published in English and Spanish. And hopefully in 2 years' time, we will also, of course, offer it for open access. Hopefully you can download that project. Okay, and now it's already, well, time's already running, but now you can imagine, so how we can analyze the patterns. Now, how can we analyze the pathways? And that's, again, an interesting story, but maybe for a later discussion. So the vertical or diachronic analysis. And Lefebvre developed a very interesting approach here, the regressive progressive method that ends in a genealogical and genetic analysis. So very briefly, you go back in history. So you have a regressive, you make a regressive analysis. So you analyze, let's say, Havana, and or a neighborhood of Havana. You go down and you try to understand how did Deep Havana come into existence. You come to certain historic moments, the revolution, but the revolution didn't produce that space, it just preserved that space. So here we suddenly understand that the revolution in Havana was somehow preserving a city. I mean, you will never ever see such a metropolis again. No, it's because you still see, you still can see, because they stopped urban development at that very moment of the revolution. At the moment of the revolution in 1959, they stopped development, and you still see where the skyscrapers started to mushroom in Vedado along the coast, and then they stopped because there is a completely different kind of approach to planning and to urban land and to urban development. Then we can go further down and ask, so where are the key elements, where are the key moments historically to understand the history of this place? And when we do that, then we can, so this is a genealogical analysis, and then we can make a genetic analysis starting up from that point and looking how this history, how this development evolved over time. I think I stop here. Maybe it is a last, I don't think that. But this one is important. So this is a book here. You can maybe give it around. So I think in 2 weeks I will have another talk, and in that book that is here, we made exactly that analysis. This kind of double analysis, the vertical and the horizontal. The horizontal with great maps, and in a similar way as we developed it for Havana. And then we made also this, let's say, vertical analysis, this regressive, progressive analysis for seven large metropolitan territories. And that I will present in 2 weeks. And there we developed a fully fledged kind of methodology to analyze that. So this is just an example what you can do with Lefebvre's theory, which is an encompassing theory. You can try to understand the big picture of that theory, what I did, and then you can try really to apply it. And I know that some of you are thinking about how can we apply Lefebvre. And I think from our experience, Lefebvre don't tell you how you can apply his theory. He delivers his theory. And you have to find out how to apply it. And you have to be inventive, and you have to try how can you approach it, how can you use this theory in your research. You can do it in many different ways, and there's not a wrong way. I think that's also always the point. Maybe I make it wrong. No. You can. It's an inspiration, and it can help you really to understand urbanization processes or all sorts of spatial processes in a much clearer light, and then you have to find out how to approach it. And there are many different ways to analyze that and to empirically research it. There is not, let's say, one privileged way to do that. And you see that we constantly were inventing new methods and try to apply Lefebvre's theory. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Christian. A gente pode abrir. Alô?
A gente pode abrir para questões do público agora. Pode ser em português, eu faço o exercício de traduzir para o Christian.
Yeah.
Muito alto, né?
Eu queria perguntar para ele se, dentro daquele triângulo, ele tinha falado do espaço consul, que é o espaço concebido, né? Imaginário. Eu queria saber se na teoria do Lefebvre ele explora também, ou como ele pensa, ou se isso se encaixa nesse vértice, o espaço imaginário, tipo, aquele espaço que, por exemplo, está sendo vendido, tipo, o espaço que aparece, sabe, em anúncio de tipo, novos loteamentos, sabe, tipo, se dá para analisar não só o espaço que existe, mas esse espaço feito para gentrificar ou acelerar a urbanização fora dos limites que já tem.
Yes.
Space is possible to analyze or to understand the imaginative space. The space that people are trying to sell to you and offer merchandise.
Yes.
How imagine the space is grasping this dialectics.
Okay, I have even this was the slide I skipped. So. So here is the question of the problem of representation. So we can say that Lefebvre developed an entire theory of representation. And the interesting thing is that so we have this distinction between conceived space and lived space. And he had a second row of terms. So he had representation of space and spaces of representation. Very disturbing, no? So what is the problem here? And so I think you understand the term representation, but I will come back to that in a moment. So the simple point, a representation of space, so the representation, so very simple, the representation of a dog doesn't bark. You probably know Marguerite, ceci n'est pas une pipe. It's a representation of a pipe, it's not a pipe. Now, why then he has spaces of representation? And the point is that it's just, representation of spaces of representation is just the other way around. But spaces of representation are spaces that represent something. So, very classically, this I don't know, church represents God or represents, I don't know, Catholicism or whatever, no? Or a building represents the state, or a place represents the revolution also. No? We have monuments for the revolution, or the famous Bastille in Paris, the storm on the Bastille. So that became a space of representation. So that's the first thing. So these kind of spaces of representations are always linked with experiences and with symbolisms. But what is with the representation of space? And here he makes an interesting distinction. And he goes back to German. He says in German, you can say for a representation is Darstellung and Vorstellung. And the interesting thing is that Darstellung is you show something. You make a map, you show a picture. No, you show something. Vorstellung is imagining something. So is this a pure mental process? Very often if you talk about spaces, it's a pure mental thing. This is a dangerous space. No? You can't show that. This is pure in your mental. What is a danger? Can a space be dangerous? And now you had the question about so let's say the industry is selling us. Tourism is selling us these spaces. So that's exactly on that second level. This is a pure imagination. They sell us something, and that they produce that space in their advertising, in the way how they sell it, and well, we pay a lot of money for that, and then maybe we are disappointed, but maybe we said, oh, it was so expensive, so it must have been good, no? So this kind of, this is exactly the entire business. But it goes very far. Because all that most of you are doing is also representations of space. So if you are architects and you are designing something, this is also representation of space. No? If you are geographers and you are doing maps, this is also representation of space. So we are constructing that space. This is not a space that as such exists. It is a space that we design. And so you see that is a very slippery kind of. We can also lie, no? We can. To make even our exercises I showed you, these are representations of space. So if we make these maps, and now why are these representations better than others? Because we work together with the people. We work together in a project. We want really to understand something about that space, and we don't want to sell that space. But we have somehow good intentions. the result can still be contested, of course.
So, hi, we've met before, but I'm a PhD candidate here, and I'm quite interested in the language lately. In your book, How and Gesellschaft, you talk a lot about the language theory of Lefebvre, but as far as I could understand it, it's mostly on the representation of space point of that triangle that you showed, right? I've been thinking about like how can we benefit from somehow understanding language as a social practice as well, because this is what is intriguing me right now. I've been discussing with Rita, who is the professor here as well, about like how we construct the Portuguese language here in Brazil, and this is some type of counter public sphere. I don't know. Can we benefit from this in territorial analysis?
I mean, I show this image because Lefebvre wrote an entire book, Le Langage et la Société, and it's finally translated into English. It's really an interesting book, and he uses exactly the same approach. Even before he published that in the production of space, he developed it here. I mean, of course, it's not the time now to explain that, but it's an interesting thing. So, and he understood language as a very important. I mean, French structuralist Ferdinand de Saussure. I mean, he said we can't even think without a language, no. But for Lefebvre, he even goes a step further and says, language is the seat of power. So without language, we don't have the power. So, so he is very, very, let's say, suspicious about the way how language is forming our realities, our own realities. And I think we live in a time where this is very, very, very. I think it's really what we can see now. How we see entire shifts in societies, and they are transported through language, and the way, the use of language in various ways. And I think that's so here we found a lot of interesting elements in Lefebvre's theory, but it has still to be excavated. It's I don't know any study that used that work, but it's a very interesting work.
Tem que ligar.
Quando se pensa na representação do espaço e você vai tratar desse complexo horizontal-vertical, você vai associar o vertical a uma análise diacrônica. Eu queria escutar um pouco mais sobre o que seria essa análise diacrônica, se é possível também pensar em heterocronismos e, além disso, pensando o espaço representacional como propositivo, o que seria essa chave?
A segunda?
A segunda é a relação entre a representação e a proposição do espaço.
Yes. Okay. So these are two different questions. I just start with the second. So I showed you this portrait of Switzerland. I mean, only a very little bit. No, the book has more than 1,000 pages. But this was exactly what we did. So we somehow put this analysis to the point where it becomes a project. You make an analysis, you go as far as possible, and it turns suddenly into a project. I mean, we did that with architects. And in fact, Havana is exactly the same. We applied the same approach here. So we made the analysis as precisely as possible of the present and tried to detect in the present the potentials for the future. It's a very classic approach actually in architecture and urban design. But we did it on a quite, also on a methodological level to really bring that. So, so in a certain way, there are maps that I showed here. This is on the one hand the result of the analysis, and on the other it's a project. Yeah? So that's how we did that. And I think for architects and urban designers it's relatively obvious, but even for geographers and sociologists who work in these fields, we always make also kind of proposals for, I mean, even if we design kind of metropolitan regions and stuff, and there they are in fact also proposals, but they are very problematic because they don't tell us that they are proposals. They say we are kind of neutrals, this is a neutral scientific exercise, which is never true. Which is never true. No, it is always, it's never innocent. It's always, you always somehow propose something if you design something. And so here we try to make that on a very conscious level and to make it transparent. So to lay open the sources of our analysis and our reflections. Now, the other question would need more time, and maybe I could explain that in my next talk, because so you have, of course, always a polychronic situation, this, if you do that with, let's say, this regressive progressive analysis, you can't do it, let's say, for Havana. You have to do it for smaller units, because otherwise you don't understand it. I mean, immediately if you have, let's say, some places, you have an old core and that has a history that goes back for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then you have some remote peripheries, and they also go back for hundreds of years, but in a very different way. And we did that, for instance, for Paris, and showed at the example of Paris between center and periphery, where we really made a strong analysis of center and periphery, and we showed how these are different stories that are usually subsumed into the story of Paris, which is completely wrong, because I mean, Paris is extreme in that respect, because the peripheries were always very important and were always places of rebels and revolutions. So here you need this kind of differentiation. And so that's, of course, that's the reason why we make patterns and pathways. So you need the patterns, and then you have to analyze, which at the end becomes a huge thing, but so you have to somehow make it in a way that you can still manage to do it, otherwise you work for years and years. But I mean, theoretically, yes, you make this, what we call urban configurations, and you tell the story of each of these urban configurations. But if they are heterogeneous, then it gets even more complicated. No? So, but that's somehow the idea behind it. And at least you can show it in an exemplary way, so that you don't tell, you should never tell, say, I tell now the story of Belo Horizonte. Doesn't make any sense, because this is a much more complex story, and you have to tell a much broader story, and these are many different stories with many different temporalities.
Hello. So I was wondering, instead of putting industry and the technicism as a medium for achieving something higher, something that he calls sometimes philosophy, but I think it's something in a way of a higher sense of living. I don't know how I would say, maybe the practice of urbanism. We have changed it. We put the consumism, we put the industry in first place, so people, we have a society of consumers instead of a society of civilians, of citizens. We're not affecting the citizenship. So we can say of an urban crisis in this way. How do you see this that he wrote in '69 with the social media, with the internet, with all this technology that we have today that puts things in a different approach?
Well, yeah, it's a very different story. I mean, the point is that Lefebvre was very precise in his analysis, and he saw already processes that unfolded much later. But he could never ever imagine a society in which we are living now. It was unimaginable at the time, I think for anybody. So, of course, I mean, Lefebvre is one of those theoricians who really look, I mean, he's really in contact with empirical examples. He doesn't make just abstract stuff. He always looks on concrete developments. And you see already how his writing is changing from the 50s to the 60s to the 70s. And then it ends, and I think that was the point where then we somehow restarted. I mean, his last text was written in 1989, published in Le Monde Diplomatique, and it ended with the planetary. So the planetary, quand la ville se perd dans l'urbanisation planétaire. So when the city is losing itself in planetary urbanization. And that was exactly the point where Wilbrenner and I then somehow restarted to think about the contemporary world. I didn't talk about that today because I can't talk about everything, but I will bring it forward in the next two, particularly in the third contribution I will give. So yes, so it is a very different world, it's a very different map, it's very different situations, and we are far away from really understanding these new situations. And one of the main problems is that that the scientific research and the scientific concepts are still pre-Lefebvrean, you know? So we still have debates about cities and countryside and whether this is still urban or rural, or in situations where all these terms are completely useless. We would need new terms, and we need new concepts to understand what's going on. We can't use the terms that are 100 years old. No, it is completely useless. This world changed so dramatically in such a short time. And we still have heavy battles about that. And so this was also one of the reasons why we called that book New Vocabularies for an Urbanizing Planet. You know? We need new vocabularies. And this is not something that a team can do. This is even not, I mean, one person anyway, no, but even a team can't do that. This is a collective project. And that's an invitation, of course, that we really go on that path and look on this dramatically transformed world and stop to somehow still live in a distant past where there was idyllic rural landscapes that were never ever idyllic, but always cruel and brutal, and where cities were never kind of, they had their golden times, but the golden times were horrible for many people living in those cities. So we should think about that, you know? And we should really confront our analysis with the current situation of war and ghettos and all sorts of refugee camps and all sorts of shanty towns and all sorts of contradictions and kind of absurd, islands of wealth and power, of billionaires, and so on and so forth. No? And of course, a world where we have social media, and we have cell phones, and we have smartphones, and we have all sorts of things. And now we have artificial intelligence. And what that makes with our world and with our own world. And we are far away from understanding what's going on.
Muito obrigada por sua apresentação. Gostaria de saber se você fala francês. You speak French?
Yes, I speak French.
Ah, vai ser mais fácil para mim. Ok. J'aimerais savoir, dans les villes latino-américaines, comment les concepts de Lefebvre, la position de l'espace, peuvent aider à comprendre mieux la question de la violence urbaine de les villes latino-américaines.
That I didn't fully understand.
Ok. Vou tentar em português. Nas cidades latino-americanas, como as teorias do Lefebvre, Space Production, nos ajuda a entender mais a questão da violência urbana.
Urban violence. Violence urbaine. Well, he didn't really address this question. You have to understand these were different times, and he comes from a kind of revolutionary strand, and he comes from Paris, and that was always his kind of point of reference. And in Paris, you had quite some revolutions and rebels in the last 250 years, no? Starting with the French, and then with the Commune, and so on and so forth. So, and then 68. And then this was always linked to, to also, a revolutionary movements, and to change, to a evolutionary change. So this kind of urban balance that we are facing is also something that arrived in Paris. I followed that quite closely because I lived in Paris for some time. And actually this kind of, what we would call urban balance started in Paris in the 1980s. With the kind of a process that we also analyzed, what we call a peripheralization of the Parisian working class. And that's a complex process. So, so Lefebvre doesn't help us here, so we have to make our own stories out of it. But of course, what helps us is to understand that this violence, without going into any detail, has always several sides. You know? On one side is how it is. Again, we can use Lefebvre. So what really happens? What happens in the, let's say, physical world? How is it reported about? What kind of legends are constructed out of it? What kind of representations are presented to us? And then, of course, lived space, what does it mean to be confronted with this kind of violence? And it's always various forms of violence, it's always a kind of contradictory process. I think that's, but then we have to make our own analysis out of it.
Mais alguém? So,
It's late. It's late.
so Christian, thank you very much for your lecture and
Thank you very much.